It's a collection of the most timeless and influential myths in human history that have served as the foundation of our world. I'm talking about the Bible, and in this video, we're going to investigate its first book, Genesis, specifically why Genesis chapters 1 through 11 is mythology. We'll explore this by comparing four key themes: origins of the cosmos and humans, celestial objects, and cities, to other ancient Mesopotamian myths. To answer the question, was Genesis inspired by other ancient Near Eastern myths? So let's jump right in. We'll begin with the cosmic creation accounts found within these narratives. And while nearly every ancient Near Eastern culture shared a common worldview, that of a three-tiered cosmology, whose origins are rooted in a deity or deities bringing order to the primordial chaos, the process of how this order was achieved differed significantly between the accounts, most notably to the biblical account. Now, in the Babylonian creation story of Enuma Elish, this order is achieved through combat. More specifically, it's the story of the creator god's struggle against the power of chaos to establish the world. In summary, there's a group of high gods that emerge from the commingling of Tiamat, who is the salt water in the ocean, and also the chaotic sea monster, sea serpent, or sea dragon from the account, and Apsu, who is the fresh water under the earth. However, due to various circumstances, Apsu tries to kill the gods, but he is slain by Ea, the god of wisdom. This causes Tiamat to attack the gods, who then call on Ea's son, Marduk, to fight on their behalf. And Marduk kills Tiamat, and then uses her carcass to create the world. He splits her, stretches out half of her to form the heavens, and establishes the other half as the earth and the underworld. Now, in Egypt, there are four major versions of the same basic mythic creation cycle. And while there are slight variations between the four accounts, they mostly follow the same basic storyline. And that is, out of the primordial waters, the creator god Atum emerged, or was self-generated. And Atum proceeds to generate the Ennead, which is a group of 8 Egyptian deities that are ultimately worshipped and contribute in some way, shape, or fashion to the creation of the world and of Egypt. Now, the biblical creation myth differs from these accounts in two unique ways. First, that God exercises complete control over the chaos. There's no battling against other deities to achieve order over the chaos, or God creating other divine beings to assist in the creation of the world, or God simply emerging out of the nothingness. He simply just is in the biblical text, and throughout the entire biblical narrative, that is the understanding. The other difference, which we already hit on a little bit, is that all of the other accounts outside of the biblical narrative portray a polytheistic religious worldview, whereas in the biblical text, it is one unique God. It is a monotheistic worldview. Now, it is important to note that the definition of biblical monotheism differs from our current understanding of what monotheism is. And if you want to know more on that topic, I'll link a video in the description below. Now we're going to shift on to the creation of human beings within these various accounts. And the two areas of focus for this are going to be how the human beings were created and the role in which they were created to serve. Returning to Egypt, the creation of humanity is rare in Egyptian texts, but there is one text, the coffin text, that suggests that human beings were born from the tears shed from Atum's eyes. The text reads, "I made the gods evolve from my sweat, while people are from the tears of my eye." Shifting over to the Sumerian creation accounts of human beings, the Eridu Genesis mentions the creations of humans and animals by a set of gods. And there's also the Atrahasis epic, which is an old Babylonian or Mesopotamian narrative that recounts the creation of human beings as well as the flood. Now, in terms of the creation of human beings, this comes about at a council of the great gods because the lesser gods have been complaining. And so what ends up happening is that one of the lesser gods is killed, and the blood of that god is mixed with clay to form the human beings. And this is in sharp contrast and far less graphic than what we find in the second creation account in Genesis 2 through 3, where a mist is going up from the land and watering the whole face of the ground. And from this, the Lord forms the human of dust, or I've also heard it described as mud, from the ground, and then breathes into this human's nostrils the breath of life. And then the human became a living creature. And this is a great transition into the role that human beings play within these tales. And that is that within each of these myths, the Eridu Genesis, the Atrahasis, and the Enuma Elish, human beings are created to do the work of the gods, to essentially be slaves for the gods' labor, because the gods were tired of doing the work. And therefore they created human beings to be their workers or slaves. Now, this is a sharp contrast to the biblical text, where human beings are created in the image of God and are placed as God's representatives on earth and are granted dominion over all of the earth, and are also given the role of tending the Garden of Eden, which is the Garden of Paradise. Eden is where heaven meets earth within the biblical narrative. And it's long been recognized that these two humans that have been uniquely placed in the Garden of Eden are given a role that aligns with priestly duties within the Israelite religion. And furthermore, human beings within the biblical narrative enjoy a personal relationship with God. And on that point, it is worth mentioning that there are two creation accounts in Genesis, Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. Now, Genesis chapter 1 is the priestly account. It is not as old as Genesis chapter 2. It was written by the priestly class, or the P source, if you're familiar with the JEPD theory. And in Genesis chapter 1, God is the author, creator, and the sustainer of the entire cosmos. He is the supreme deity. And then in chapter 2, which is the J source, or the Yahweh source, viewed as the earliest source amongst the four source categories. And J uses anthropomorphic language to describe God walking in the garden with the human beings that he has created. And from here we get the idea that even from very early on, God was seen as caring for and desiring a personal relationship with the human beings that he created. Now, it is worth mentioning here that there is an Egyptian text known as the Instruction of Merikari, which describes all of humanity being created in the image of God as well. However, there is a very sharp contrast between how human beings were created and also the role in which they were created to serve when comparing the biblical text to the other ancient Near Eastern text. Now, what typically goes side by side with creation mythologies is flood mythologies. And if you are curious about that, I've covered the comparative flood mythologies in another video, so I'm not going to cover that here, but I will throw a link in the description below if you want to check that out. And now to the third topic, celestial beings, the sun, the moon, and the stars, sometimes referred to in the biblical text as the host of heaven. And the worship of these celestial objects was commonplace across all of the cultures mentioned thus far, with one exception. But we'll come back to that in a minute, because first I want to discuss the cultures that did worship these celestial objects. And we'll start with ancient Egypt, where within the Old Kingdom, star worship was much more pronounced than in later kingdoms. And while Egyptian texts refer to celestial bodies as natural objects, they also assigned divinity to the stars. And certain deities were more related to these celestial bodies than others, such as the sun god Re, as well as the goddesses Nut and Sothis, who were believed to be the starry night sky and the star Sirius. But as one scholar put it, it would be a mistake to presume that the Egyptian conception of gods was divorced from the stars and other celestial bodies. And Re is not the only Egyptian deity that is identified with the sun. There's other deities that are as well. And there's various traditions as to the sun's journey across the sky, through the underworld every night, and then back in the sky the next morning. One of those traditions is that the sun is reborn from the goddess Nut, while other traditions simply have the sun traveling through the sky in a boat. Similar to Egypt, certain Mesopotamian gods were identified with or as celestial objects. Examples of this are the sun, Shamash, the moon, Nana, and Venus, Inanna or Ishtar. However, most of the Mesopotamian deities are not astral in nature. But it's also important to note that within Mesopotamian culture, the gods and goddesses lived in regions that were either impossible or improper for human beings to inhabit. Therefore, you have certain gods and goddesses associated with the underworld, and because it could be observed that celestial objects moved, it was therefore believed that these objects were living entities or under the power of living entities. And what's incredibly interesting to note is that both the Sumerian and Akkadian words for deity, or God, are associated with the cuneiform sign for star. And just as within Mesopotamian Egypt, Ugaritic texts contain evidence that deities were associated with the stars. And there is a scholar, though I can't pronounce her first name, but her last name is Korpel, and she has a book titled A Rift in the Clouds, Ugarit and Hebrew Descriptions of the Divine. And within this book, she produces several astral descriptions of the gods. And these include heavenly ones, star gods, the race of heaven, and lords of the stars. And the god El is also mentioned in texts with other gods that have well-known associations with celestial objects, such as Shahar and Shalim, that is, dawn and dusk, as well as the sun and the moon. Now, what's evident across all these cultures is the fact that these objects moved or appeared to move across the night sky, and they moved in patterns that governed the night, the day, the times, and the seasons. And therefore, they needed an explanation as to why this was the case. And the explanation that was provided was that these were living or divine beings, or under the power of a divine being or entity. We can even see evidence of this within the Greco-Roman culture, where the sun, moon, and stars were considered eternal, while gods such as Zeus, Hera, and Poseidon were considered immortals. So even in the Greco-Roman culture, a distinction existed between these celestial objects and the main deities of their pantheon. Now, it is true that within the biblical text, in some instances, these celestial objects are referred to as the host of heaven. And there is even correlation between the angels and the stars. We even see evidence of this thought in Paul's letter to Rome in Romans 4:18. But the reason for this is that the ancient Israelites were part of the ancient Near Eastern culture. And just like the other cultures, they could see these celestial bodies moving across the night sky. However, a major point of difference within the Israelite culture and the biblical text compared to all of these other cultures and religions is that within the biblical text, the celestial bodies were created by Yahweh. We see this in Genesis 1:14, where the text states, "And God said, let there be lights in the expanse of the heavens to separate the day from night, and let them be for signs and for appointed times." That word season means appointed times or appointed festivals. "And for days and years. And let them be lights in the expanse of the heavens to give light upon the earth." And so what we see is that these celestial bodies were not deities. They were simply celestial bodies that were created for a specific purpose. In fact, the Dictionary of Deities and Demons summarizes this well. It states this: "A third group of deities consists of gods mentioned in the Bible, but not in their capacity as gods. They're the so-called demythologized deities. Examples abound. One of the Hebrew words for moon used in the Bible is Yereah. This is the etymological equivalent of Yarik, the moon god known from Ugaritic texts. Although the moon may have retained faint traces of divinity in the Bible, it has basically been divested of its divine status. The same holds true for the sun. The Hebrew word corresponds with the god Shamash in Akkadian and the goddess Shapshu. Now, this is not to deny that within ancient Israel there was worship of the sun, moon, and stars. There clearly was, based on the data within the biblical text. However, regarding Orthodox Israelite religion, any worship outside of Yahweh alone was strictly forbidden within the biblical text. There are numerous examples, but perhaps the best is in Deuteronomy 4:19, where it describes the sun, the moon, and the stars as the host of heaven, but speaks of how these were allotted to all of the nations under heaven. And this is a direct correlation to both Deuteronomy 32 as well as the Tower of Babel, when humanity, according to the biblical text, rebelled against God, and therefore God allotted the nations away. Now let's move on to cities. Cities were a pinnacle of civilization across the ancient Near East, and therefore seen as vitally important to civilization. We see evidence of this in the Eridu Genesis, which after the creation of humans and animals proceeds to narrate how the mother goddess Nintur establishes great cities and their kings. The importance of both the city and the king is something that can be seen across all of the ancient Near East, with perhaps the clearest example from both within the biblical text and surrounding text is the city of Babylon. This is vitally important to ancient Egypt as well. They were centers of religion, trade, as well as political power. They were often built near the Nile River, which was also a personified deity within ancient Egypt, and this was for access to its resources as well as transportation. However, this is in stark contrast to what we find within the biblical text. The first instance we see of the city is opposed to the garden paradise of Eden Yahweh created for humanity. And this is because the person that builds the first city within the biblical text is Cain. This is Genesis chapter 4, verse 17, where Cain, after murdering his brother Abel, is banished east away from God's presence. And Cain takes a wife, he has a son, and Cain is essentially worried that people are going to kill him. And instead of trusting that he would be avenged if that were to take place, Cain builds a city and names it after his son. And this starts a long line of the city being a place within the biblical text where cities are portrayed as a response to human violence and corruption. And this is not to say that all cities are bad within the biblical text. There's obviously the city of Jerusalem. And in fact, Jerusalem, and specifically the temple, is built as a reflection of the garden in Eden. Back to Cain's story. After Cain founds this first city, what ends up happening within the progression of Genesis 1 through 11 is you get one of Cain's descendants, a man named Lamech, who is the first person within the biblical text to take two wives, and this is portrayed as a very negative thing as well. And then in poetic form, Lamech openly boasts to his wives about how he is a murderer. And eventually, through a sequence of events, this leads to the Tower of Babel, where all of the people gather together as one to make their name great by making the tower that reaches up to the heavens. And essentially this was to tame a deity, and therefore anyone that wanted to worship this deity would have to come to that city to worship him, therefore making the city great. This is in direct opposition to the Edenic mandate of being fruitful and multiplying across the earth. And this is the point within the biblical story where God has had enough and disperses the people, and he allots them away to the sons of God, which can be read about in Deuteronomy 32. And to summarize this topic of cities, what we find is that within every other text, aside from the biblical text, the city was viewed as an ideal place. It was a place where religion and politics thrived, whereas within the biblical text, the garden setting was viewed as the ideal, a place where one would not have to build up walls for fear of human corruption and violence. And now that we've broadly covered these four topics, we can return to the original question. Was Genesis 1 through 11 inspired by other ancient Near Eastern myths? And the answer to this is entirely dependent on how you define inspired. And to be clear, this video is not to discuss the theological position on inspiration. And unfortunately, what often happens is that inspiration gets conflated with dependency. The stories recorded in the Bible were written later than these other ancient Near Eastern stories. But this is not because the biblical writers are simply pulling the old edit, copy, edit, paste trick, but rather they are writing narratives based on common knowledge of the day. They are not stealing stories that they had no prior knowledge of. So perhaps we can say that the biblical text was inspired in the sense that the biblical writers wanted to communicate what they believed the truth of the common knowledge of the day was. And all of these stories fit within the literary genre of mythology, because academically, the broad definition of mythology is any story about the activity of the gods. And therefore, what this means is that it's not just Genesis 1 through 11 that is mythology, but the entire biblical text. For Jews, Genesis through Chronicles, and for Christians, Genesis through Revelation. Because the main character and driving force behind every single event recorded within the biblical text is the first character that you meet in Genesis 1:1, the third word in the Hebrew text, and that is God. And because of this, both the religious and the skeptical side need to accept certain terms. On the religious side, these individuals need to accept that Genesis, as well as the rest of the biblical text, is mythology. And conversely, those on the skeptical side need to stop insisting that the theological messaging within Genesis 1 through 11, as well as the rest of the biblical text, must be false because Genesis in the Bible is mythic in literature. Because while myth is synonymous with fiction in our day and age, that is not true for the ancient Near East. Because for these cultures, the theme of myth was not the essence of the deities, but rather the essence of reality. And with myth properly defined, you can see that it's oxymoronic to state that the biblical text is a myth, then impose an improper definition of myth to falsify the details of the text. And all this is to say that we should expect similarities amongst these various texts because they shared both a common knowledge and a common worldview. All right, everyone, thanks so much for tuning in. I hope you found this informative. Let me know what you think in the comments below, and be sure to check out this video that YouTube is recommending just for you. Thanks so much. I'll see you in the next one.